All right, so unit 5 is about land and water use. So we kind of went over some of the basics of like watersheds and soil last time, and now we're going to be kind of shifting into how people use those resources. There are like these pages. It's a lot of kind of skipping around because of the course redesign. Probably the biggest section, I think, is this pages 203 to 221. I believe that's where it deals with a lot of the agriculture stuff. And we will have some videos. I know that I already showed you guys the Norman Borlaug video, and those notes are already on PowerSchool, like some brief notes from me. So you don't have to worry about those notes. All right, so part 1 of unit 5 is the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is this concept. It was first published by Garrett Hardin in 1968. So as far as like scientific theories that like everybody talks about, it's not as old as others. And basically he was looking at commons areas or resources or services. So it's something that is not owned by one person, but it's available in common to everyone. And he was looking at these areas and looking at how people used them. So a good example of a commons would be like ecosystem services. Other commons areas would be like fisheries in the ocean because fish move. So people often will be fishing in like international waters, but even if they're not, even if they're fishing in like US owned ocean area, the fish can move between the US and Canada. Also water and rivers, because the rivers will travel between countries. So like the countries that are upstream from each other and downstream from each other. And then the atmosphere is another good example because it doesn't stay in one place. So like if we put pollution in the atmosphere in Atlanta, that pollution is going to go, you know, outside of Atlanta pretty quickly. So the tragedy of these commons areas is that because people share this resource and it doesn't like stay in one place, where it's not like just for their use, people can tend to overuse them. So we end up with overfished oceans, we end up with polluted atmosphere, we end up with countries fighting over water. So like the downstream country will be mad at the upstream country because the upstream country built a dam and dammed up the river. So I know some of you guys, I think, read for the summer. Actually, I don't know if anybody in here did. It might have been only in the other class. One of the summer options was a book about water wars. But that's one of these like tragedies. So there are a couple ways we can manage the commons areas. This is where international agreements are really, really important. This is why we have like the Paris Climate Agreement, where countries are trying to agree on how much pollution they put in the atmosphere. This is why we have things like CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It's a way for the international community to agree that we're going to protect this common resource. So the problem is you have to have agreements between all users. One of the downsides between some of the laws, especially the whaling, because we have restrictions on whaling that are international, but Japan and Russia have not agreed to it, which means that Japanese ships will go out and they will hunt whales for what they call scientific purposes, but they do end up eating them. And the same thing with like Russia. Right now, in most countries who have signed on to these kinds of agreements about whaling, the only people who are allowed to harvest any whales are people who are like First Nations, indigenous people, and they're only allowed to do like limited numbers to like maintain their cultural heritage. But there are those other areas that kind of don't sign on and they don't agree. And when you don't have that agreement, you can't really manage the commons as a whole because whales just move too far.
Also, the thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, wouldn't it be pretty difficult to like actually manage this stuff? Because I know with CITES, which is another international agreement, like a bunch of countries agreed to it, but that doesn't stop individual actors that don't work for the government to continue like poaching and smuggling and stuff. So
exactly.
like, it doesn't exactly work unless literally everyone agrees.
Yeah, so everyone has to agree, or everyone, like all of the like governmental entities have to agree and agree on penalties. Because you're always going to have some people who are trying to like go around the law like smugglers, But if you have all the international community agree on the penalty for that, then you can actually control it a little bit better. So things like elephant tusk trade has really been cracked down on recently because there's this agreement that the countries that have signed on will penalize people who are selling ivory. But you definitely need that kind of agreement for what the penalty will be for those bad actors in order for it to work. You also, especially if it's something where we are harvesting some of it, so like if you're thinking about the fisheries off the coast of the US and Canada, you have to have a lot of meeting to adjust the use of the resource as the fisheries are depleted, or if there are too many fish, kind of in quotes, because what they're trying to do is like maintain the populations of those fish at a level where they continue to reproduce, and they reproduce at a really high rate. So if you get like too many fish in the area, they won't give birth to as many fish babies. So you may have to adjust and have like, you can harvest more fish this year or less fish the next year in order to like maintain the number of fish for the future generations. So yeah, this commons thing is this big, difficult problem basically because you're going to need so many people to agree and to agree on penalties and all of that. All right, are there any questions? Okay, the other thing I want you guys to do, the actual paper on the tragedy of the commons, I believe is right here. And it's not too long, so it would be beneficial to you to read through that and maybe take a few notes, but I've kind of given you most of the details. There's also this YouTube link that gives you a good summary of it with like some actual examples that are not the same that I did. So that might be that'll be a good thing to watch as well. All right, so now we're going to talk about forestry products, and the section is specifically on clear cutting. So we're going to kind of focus on that here. So forest products include paper pulp, wood for fuel, wood for building things. So, you know, you're going to build a house, you need some wood. And I'm sorry, I'm moving this so that the text is easier to read. About a quarter of the world's forests are managed to produce some sort of forestry product. So that's a lot of forests that we're managing, and we're actually actively taking trees in order to like provide these products. Now there are lots of different types of harvesting. I have taken this image from the OregonLoggers.org just because it does a good job kind of showing us the different types. So first is clear cutting. Clear cutting is removing all the trees in the stand. So you can see they removed all these trees in this middle section. Typically, clear cutting is going to result in even aged regrowth, which means all the trees that grow back are going to be the same age. And it's going to usually result in some negative impacts because of erosion. When you remove all the trees, the wind can go through really quickly, or the rain can kind of form a path through that area that doesn't have any roots, and it can erode more of the soil. Shelter wood or seed tree systems are a little bit different. You remove the majority of the mature trees, but you leave this protective overstory that shelters the new growth, and it provides seeds. So this is shelter wood logging or seed tree logging. These trees will prevent that increased rate of erosion. They also will drop like whatever seeds that tree has. So if we're talking about oak trees, they would drop acorns, which can grow into new trees. So they provide seeds for new growth, and they provide a little shelter. So this is really important in species of tree that don't grow well with direct sun. In the clear cutting, if you clear cut and then you plant new trees, but those new trees are best grown in partial sun, they're not going to grow very quickly here because they're going to get full sun. So this will provide for that like partial shade, partial sun growth. This also results in even-aged regrowth of the trees that were cut down because they're all going to be the same size, but you end up with multiple size classes. So as these grow, you'll have like these ones will all be really old trees, and then these groups will all be young trees. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Next is group selection or corridor harvesting. I don't have a picture of this one, but this is where you harvest mature trees or you thin intermediate sized trees at regular intervals. Basically, you're harvesting a specific group, like a size group of trees, or you're going to harvest down a row. So that's the corridor harvesting. It basically leaves room for new growth in between trees that are left after harvesting. It still results in even-aged regrowth of those like corridors that you cut. But again, you have a forest that is mixed size classes, and it can be a little bit more mixed than the shelter wood system. It depends on how it's done. These both are kind of similar goals. Leave behind some of the trees to provide that shelter and that shade and that reduction of erosion. Single tree selective harvesting is the removal of a single mature tree. This is going to give you uneven aged regrowth because trees are going to be taken due to disease or defective growth, and they're not taken due to their size class. So selective harvesting is going to be more like this. You're going to take trees that are growing in a way that damages trees nearby. You're going to take trees that are diseased. And so you're going to take like old mature trees as well as young trees. So you're going to get this uneven aged regrowth. The uneven aged growth is going to be ideal for animals, but of course, this one we're cutting down far fewer trees. So logging companies are typically going to go with this kind of shelter wood or group selection instead. The other thing is that regrowth will depend on succession. So remember we talked about like primary and secondary succession. In a forest with late successional species, if you clear cut that, you won't get those late successional species doing well. The first trees that grow back will be early successional species. So eventually you'll get those late succession species, but you might have to wait like 50 years or 80 years. So even though the regrowth is going to be kind of even aged, which is not necessarily good for animals, it also is going to tend to favor species that grow well in that full sun with bare soil. And so you're not going to necessarily get the same type of tree. And that's why most of the logging companies are really going to kind of go for the shelter wood or seed tree systems if they're looking to harvest specific species of tree. Because a lot of the times the hardwood trees are going to be your late successional species. If you want to maintain that you're going to harvest the hardwoods, they're not going to grow very well after clear cutting. Does that kind of make sense? Now you can still see clear cutting happen. So it's not like it doesn't happen, but it depends on what the like logging company is after. Yeah.
So if so shouldn't that mean that like I guess this would cause a lot of problems, right? Because hardwood trees would probably be rare since they take a while to grow, and you don't exactly want other kinds of trees. So wouldn't that like I don't know, I feel like that would cause a lot of problems because if there's a disproportionate number of like different species of trees that could like affect a lot of things like food supplies for organisms and like um, what nutrients are and are not absorbed from the soil and stuff like that. I don't know. I'm just thinking that could lead to like really bad repercussions. And also like, I guess if you're cutting down trees and planting new ones, well, I know that like rotting wood and logs are important for soil and like they provide homes for a lot of like a lot of other organisms. So doesn't that like cause a lot of other ecosystem problems? Like no matter which type of, I guess, which type of, uh, what do you call it? Which type of logging you do?
Yeah. So depending on which type of logging, there are like pluses and minuses. You'll notice like if you go to the mountains kind of in North Georgia, Alabama area, we have a lot of pine forest, and pine grows really well as kind of a in those areas that have been clear cut. At least it does better than most other trees. So you'll see a lot of clear cutting. You'll actually like if you are driving, you can see areas that have been clear cut. Because what the logging companies are doing is they're doing whatever is going to be economically best and give them more trees in the future because a lot of them will own that land. Or there are some cases where they're actually logging on government land, but we'll talk about that later on. But yeah, if you are harvesting like hardwoods, this is one reason why they're going to be more expensive. So if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, you'll notice different costs for the different types of wood for building because of how they have to harvest it in order to like continue to grow trees for future harvest. The other thing that you mentioned with like the rotting logs and things. There are some companies that are now trying to encourage the logging companies to cut off the larger limbs and leave behind some of those to provide that habitat. Because yeah, that habitat is really important for growth of future trees, and then also like the animals that live there. So we'll talk a little bit about, I think at the end of this unit, about how you can know like how the wood you buy is harvested. But there's a lot of different like permutations and types of harvesting, and they're all going to have like downsides basically, because the
Right.
forest is not designed for us to harvest stuff from it. But people need paper, people need, you know, all these other products up here. So it's just a matter of harvesting them in a way that's less like problematic. So there are two main ways that a lot of the companies will do things. There's either the monocultural agroforestry, that's where they're going to grow a single species. This is where you can maximize growth, you simplify the harvesting, and you get that very low biodiversity. This is basically growing trees as if they are an agricultural crop. This is what we see in a lot of places where they're growing the cheaper woods, the things that are going to be more cost effective if you're going to like Home Depot. The native harvest, this is going to be more difficult harvesting because you're going to be going in between other trees trying to take out specific trees usually, but you maintain that higher biodiversity, and you usually can maintain like better growth of younger trees as well. Now, most of the time, the forests that are managed and that are owned by like logging companies are going to be that monoculture, because it's going to be more economically efficient for them. There is some pushback now that people can see, like, was this harvested sustainably? And so now there's going to be more companies that are kind of trying to add in some sustainable practices. I don't think I have anything with the logo on it right now, but there is a logo for the sustainable forestry group that will like certify different wood products.
So I've heard that a lot of, like, I know that the wood and stuff that we, and paper that we use is like, we plant the trees back whenever we cut them. But how do we know that it's not just like, it's not like the monoculture thing, which is like, they're basically growing trees as agricultural crops, so they have to plant them back, I guess.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Like planting a tree because they chopped one down is actually an economically like good thing for the company to do, right? They're going to want to harvest another tree later.
right.
But there is here, I'm going to see if I can find the information really quick. The Forest Stewardship Council, they do this certification. So it looks like this, the check with the tree. You've probably seen it on like cardboard boxes. And they have specific requirements for getting that require the forest to be more responsibly managed. They don't just have to plant a tree. They have to also provide for these kind of other things. You can actually look at the standards, I think, here. So there's these two types, either forest management or the chain of custody, and they've got these specific, yeah, so they've got specific things that they're looking for, but it looks like on their website now, you have to contact someone to get like the full list or to get like help with meeting it. I'll look and see if I can find the list, because I know I saw it like last year. But they have specific things they're looking for to make sure that the forest is like more responsibly harvested. So not just planting the trees, but also like, you know, not doing clear cutting, making sure you're going to decrease the erosion from harvesting, that kind of thing. All right, I'm going to talk just a little. We're going to do this Green Revolution section quick because we already watched the video on it, so it should go fast, and then we can kind of stop for the day. So the Green Revolution is credited with allowing the world's food supply to keep pace with rapid growth. So between 1952 and 1987, the world population doubled. It went from 2.6 to 5.2 billion. And of course, it's continued to increase, right? Because of this, we really needed to increase that food supply. So they talked in the video about how there were some like people who had basically written off whole countries as going to starve to death because they just didn't have the food. So what they did was they replaced traditional crops with these high yielding monocultures and these like large inputs of organic fertilizer, pesticide use, and things like that. Now, obviously, some of these things are not great, right? We don't like to use like lots of fertilizer and lots of pesticide for other reasons now. But at the time, this was one of the ways that they could get enough food to feed people. Some of the things that they developed during this green revolution, though, are still used today and are like pretty environmentally friendly. Doing monoculture is not the best, and we'll talk about why monoculture is not good later. But some of the things like mechanization for planting and harvesting can actually be environmentally beneficial because you're not going through and tilling the soil in the same way, which means you're reducing the risks of erosion. The other thing is GMOs have been used to either contain more nutrients, be able to withstand drought or pests, be able to withstand herbicides, things like that. And a lot of times these GMOs are actually going to allow farmers to grow more food to like feed people in a smaller area. So overall, that can be seen kind of as a good thing because it allows the countries that use these to protect the land nearby. So like I said with the forest stuff, like there's always going to be pluses and minuses, like people need to eat. And it's just a matter of trying to do the thing that's going to be best for everyone. So it's going to make food for people. It's also going to protect the environment for future generations of people. Most of the grocery store contains GM products, about 75%. So if you go down the aisles in the grocery store, not around the outside where they have like fresh produce and stuff, most of that is genetically modified. Most of that, though, is just one of a few crops. Corn, soy, and cotton are the top 3 in the US, although we don't eat the cotton. Alfalfa, potato, and sugar beet are also commonly GM in order to produce like more food for smaller like input. So they can also be tailored to provide health benefits. There is golden rice, which was grown in China to include vitamin A, because vitamin A deficiency was a problem in some rural parts of China. It's not the best solution in some ways because growing something like golden rice takes a lot of fertilizer and things like that. But it does have that added vitamin. And this was kind of like a test case of, can we do this? Can we genetically modify something to be healthier? There is possibility of increased shelf life, but a lot of that comes from like manufacturing. And a lot of the GM crops are put into things like granola bars. So those have an increased shelf life. But the big thing that I want to focus on here is it takes less land to grow more food. So while GM crops can be a problem, and we'll talk about those problems in a second, you can also grow more food on a smaller amount of area with these genetically modified crops. And that's kind of what Norman Borlaug was doing, but he was doing it through selective breeding with the wheat. He was trying to get wheat that would produce more yield, and it would grow quickly, and it wouldn't grow so tall that it fell over. So that was a type of genetic modification. It's just not the same type we use today. Now, this is where it can get kind of tricky. Most GMOs have been engineered for pest resistance or herbicide tolerance. There is some concern that this will increase like the use of herbicides. It will increase the use of, or that it will like make the pests more resistant. So it will make the pests evolve resistance to these plants. And there are some concerns with that. In the US, the FDA does not require GMO labeling on food, but you might see foods that say like non-GMO. And then just a reminder that if we look at GMO big picture, most things are genetically modified. Here is a banana, not heritage collection from Banana Republic. Let's see. We'll see if it'll give me, no. Pre-GMO. Can I do that? Here we go. So this is what the banana was like before we modified it because people wanted to eat the banana part. These are all seeds. So nowadays, when you eat a banana, it's not filled with these seeds that would not be delicious, right? So we have genetically modified many, many things. It's something we've been doing through selective breeding for generations and thousands of years. The commercialized crops like cotton, corn, and soy, these ones are modified usually at the genetic level in a lab, not through selective breeding anymore. Most of the GMO crops are patented, and so they're legally protected, which means that a farmer that grows GMO crops has to sign an agreement that they are only going to grow those crops. And this is kind of an issue where we will see some pushback from farmers and from other people because they are forced to buy seeds every year from the same company. And if a farmer is found to be growing a GMO crop, even if it was a seed that blew in from a neighbor's yard, they can get in trouble for stealing that property from the company. So there are some issues there that we'll kind of talk about as we go on the genetic engineering. We're also going to do kind of a little like debate thing after Christmas, I think, or after Thanksgiving break, where we'll talk a little bit more about GMO and non-GMO. But kind of what I want you to take away from it today is that like there's a lot of pros and there's a lot of cons. And it's not just a clear cut thing. If we decided we were going to use no GMOs tomorrow, there would be a lot of people who starved because we wouldn't be able to make enough food. All right, so here are some examples of what we're talking about when we talk about GMO. So kind of comparing it to like natural selection, so evolution, artificial selection where humans are doing it, and then genetic engineering. So there is a little overlap between artificial selection and genetic engineering. So individuals of the population that exhibit the variation in traits, and you're going to take advantage of that. In genetic engineering, what we're talking about is we're going to manipulate the DNA or RNA. Selective breeding would fall into this category. That's where Norman was talking about in the video, or the narrator, whoever was talking, about crossbreeding strain A with strain B to see what they would get. Okay, so artificial fertilization, that's selective breeding. Irrigation is another aspect. Instead of relying on rain, irrigation was a big part of the Green Revolution. And then all of the pesticides, which we will talk about pesticides in a future section. So we're going to go into details there. The other thing that they looked at was selecting for strains that could be planted twice a year to increase yield. So again, our advantages: higher yield crops, uniform practices, which made things go quicker and reduce costs, increased profits, increased efficiency, increased yield, and decreased use of land compared to how many people they were feeding. So that meant that they didn't have to like burn down forest in order to grow more food. Disadvantages: loss of genetic diversity because we're growing like one type of crop, loss of these beneficial plants that would be like weeds in between the rows of crop, larger use of pesticides, lots of irrigation, which can cause erosion, fossil fuel use, things like that. So this is kind of just a summary, and we're going to go into details on pesticides and on GMOs again later. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.